Alrighty, we'll come back to our topic again of production systems. And as I've pointed out before, we are still dealing with that circle of institutions. We've talked about foraging cultures, we've talked about pastoral cultures. Now we want to talk about those cultures that have begun to work in the area of actually planting of their food. So we're going to talk about horticultural societies, which is the simplest form of agricultural societies. We'll move then up to intensive agriculture, which is a more advanced form of agricultural development. Then we'll move to mechanized agriculture, which would have been typical of our own nation back in the 19th and early 20th century, and ultimately move us into the present day. Now, on this, I also have the emergence of pristine states, but we're going to be skipping that section of the lecture in order to accommodate for the fact that I wasn't able to make it here last week, and we'll have to pick that up sometime into the future. So, let's talk about horticultural societies. And we'll want to talk, first of all, about the characteristics that are typical of a horticultural society. Quite typical of horticulture is that the people in such societies do their farming with the use of nothing more than implements that they can fashion and carry in their hands. Quite typically, such hand tools would consist of digging sticks that are sharpened, axes, shovels, hoes, rakes, any kind of thing that is an extension simply of the power of their arms or the power of their back. In addition to the simple hand tools, they have a few domesticated animals. They'll have a few pigs, often raised as pets, or sheep, or dogs, perhaps even a cow, goat, a few animals that they have domesticated and keep around the homestead. They do not usually have large herds that they cull for purposes of raising them for massive production. People in horticultural societies tend to live in usually very small villages. So they are people who are very closely known by one another. Everybody knows everybody else's affairs. Usually it's a face-to-face culture. Everybody is on a name basis with other people in the community. Everybody knows whose garden belongs to who, whose cow is whose cow, whose goat is whose goat. And life is a very familiar kind of lifestyle. They are a people who also tend to be very cooperative in their labor. We read in the scriptures that part of God's curse on man's sinful behavior was the curse on the land. He said that we would work by the sweat of our brow. Frankly, farming is not a lot of fun. I would not choose to be a farmer if I had any other options. You may enjoy it. Farmers may enjoy it. I don't find it extremely exciting. It is a marginal way of life. It's a lot of hard, back-breaking work. And it tends at times to be almost boring. Johnny Denver, when he was alive, could sing his cute little song about planting his little garden and watching it grow, and it has this nice little lilting tune. Bah humbug. It's not an awful fun. You've got plants that are just waiting to get sick, get ridden with bugs, and you've got animals that are just hoping that they'll get sick and die on you. I've tried to raise sheep. Dumbest, stupidest animals. And goats. Goats are supposed to be hardy creatures. I don't know what happened. I couldn't raise goats. And the only thing I could successfully raise were chickens. And I've even watched the hawks come and steal my chickens right off of my front yard. And you know, it's a lot of gruesome work. And so people learned very early that in order to live by agricultural methodologies, they would need to combine their labors. And so labor tends to be very cooperative. Folk would come together to help build mutual gardens. They would come together to help build their fences. They would come together to help build houses or their villages. And so they pooled their labor resources and turned what could be ordinarily backbreaking, exhaustive labor into a time of socialization and camaraderie. Men could work together. They could sing and they could dance. And I've watched people working out in a slash and burn agriculture. And here were all the men, see, locking arms and dancing around a field that they were turning into a new garden as they were using their feet to mulch the leaves and the branches down into the soil to make a kind of natural fertilizer in the soil. And they were just having a grand time, dancing and singing and having a wonderful time. And the women were all over preparing food for the crowd. Everybody was working, and the young people were flirting with one another, and the girls were showing off, and the guys, you know, were giggling. And eventually, of course, they'd wander off to get a cool drink down by the river, and they always planned their trips to the river to get a drink at the same time that they noticed that the girls were going, so that they would accidentally meet, you know, and you know how young people are. And so, I mean, everybody was having a grand time, but they were turning boring work into an exciting social event. And it was a way to add a little sparkle and spice to life. So labor became cooperative. It was also a society that tends to be socially organized by family groups. So most of the folk who are working together are family members. They're relatives. And after they get done with the working, they can sit around and talk about family matters. They could even have a dance together, or a sing together, or a time of festivities. And these are the kinds of things that are legendary in the lifestyle of people who lived in close family groups. It was a marvelous time. It was also a lifestyle that was characterized by what we call subsistence agriculture. Now, subsistence is not substandard. Don't get those two words mixed up. Subsistence agriculture means that you are growing food for personal use in order to continue your own personal existence, your subsistence as a family. You grow enough food for your personal needs. You don't need to grow for anybody else. Everybody else is growing their own food, so we grow enough food for us. So if I've got a family of 4, I plant a garden big enough to support a family of 4. If I've got a family of 10, I have to have a garden big enough to bring enough food in for a family of 10. And as a matter of fact, we've seen folk who will go out and prepare a huge garden site, and when they get done with the garden site, then they will break it up into plots of land. And a man who has only a small family, he's got himself and his wife and 2 kids, he only needs a small section, just enough food for the 4 of them. He only needs enough land for his wife to garden efficiently without wearing her down. But another man who maybe has 2 wives and a teenage son will need 3 plots of land because he's got more faces to feed. And so he'll take 3 plots of land. Well, they've both worked equivalently to build this plot of land, but he gets more than the other man, but nobody thinks a thing about it because he needs this much land in order to subsist. And having more land wouldn't help. Your wife can only do so much work per day before she gets completely worn out. As a matter of fact, an anthropologist by the name of Roy Rappaport went to study a group of people in New Guinea. And in the course of studying these New Guinea peoples, he discovered that one woman could, in the course of her labors, do enough work, maintain a garden sufficiently large enough to feed herself, her husband, 2 children, and 3.5 pigs. And after that, she was being overworked. She started to grumble and complain. She was being worn down. So that's all the larger garden she wanted. If her husband had more kids or wanted more pigs, he had to somehow get more additional labor into that family unit. So you'd bring in your mother-in-law, or bring in a cousin or a nephew or a niece or somebody else who could help work in the garden. And by bringing in an additional labor force, you could then have a larger garden, feed more people, feed more pigs, have a bigger herd, and get wealthy. But women would know their limit and say, look, I can't work any harder. That's it. So subsistence agriculture, was simply an agricultural lifestyle that would continue to meet the needs of an immediate family. And everybody grew enough food for themselves. Now, there were various ways in which you could go about your horticultural practices. There were various types of horticultural societies. There was what we call stick gardening or dry land gardening that was typical of certain North American Indian tribes, for instance. In this particular technique, what you would have would be a person with a long stick, sharp on one end, perhaps hardened in a fire, and they would poke a hole in the soil, drop a seed in, cover it over with their foot, take a few steps, poke another hole, drop a seed in, cover it over with their foot, and you would move then through a small glen or glade and plant a field of corn in this way. It was minimal preparation. It did not require a lot of soil preparation. All you had to do was find a nice open plot of land where sunshine could come in and have the seed corn that you needed, or whatever else that it was that you were going to be planting. If you wanted to plant white potatoes or sweet potatoes or whatever else. It required minimum land preparation. And because it required minimum land preparation, there was minimal impact on the ecology of the region. You didn't have to change what was normally there. All you were doing was adding one more plant product into the natural ecology of the region. And frankly, you didn't have to have large gardens, because for horticulturalists, what you were trying to do was supplement what you could get from the natural environment. In addition to the berries and the nuts and the fruits and the game animals, you wanted some kind of corn or rice or sweet potatoes, something else to add some calories to your diet, or if it was in a culture in which you had to store food for a winter, you wanted to have a winter supply of food. So you supplemented your available food supply. And when you planted a garden, you would plant a variety of things together. You would have maybe corn and sweet potatoes growing side by side, because you were planting in a very kind of impromptu kind of thing, and products would grow together, which meant that you weren't depleting the soils of any one kind of nutrition in order to feed one kind of a crop. What the corn was taking out, the sweet potatoes wouldn't be. What the corn was adding, the sweet potatoes would draw from, and vice versa. And it was a very efficient way to grow food. Now, this was just one way of growing food in horticultural types of societies. Another common horticultural type of practice was what we call slash and burn or shifting agriculture. And slash and burn or shifting agriculture is generally found in tropical areas. Now, an entirely different set of growing conditions exist in tropical environments. You have far more rainfall in the tropics. You have to account for the tremendous rainfall. That tremendous rainfall has a very detrimental effect upon agricultural conditions. Instead of measuring rain in inches, you measure it in feet. See? What we would get here in the course of a whole year's rain, you would get in the tropics in 1 week. So rainfall will sometimes be measured in terms of foot a week. See, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 feet of rain. See, in a month during the rainy season. Well, all of that heavy rainfall falling on the soil tends to leach the nutrients in the soil very, very deeply into the soil. The soil becomes very infertile very, very quickly. So that if you see this huge tract of land, you think, oh, wow, look, I'm really going to have a rich garden here. You go out, you plow it all up, you plant your vegetables, you plant your crops, nothing. See? The soil is just incapable of sustaining much of a productive base of food. It can grow a few grains, a few grasses. It can grow some simple plants, but it is not capable of sustaining a lot of life. You look at those huge canopy of things that are growing there. You look at the lush undergrowth, you know, crawling vines and plants all over the place, and huge trees that grow up to 50, 60, 75 feet in the air, sometimes 100 or more feet in the air, and you think, wow, the soil here must be really rich. But once you cut all that down, you discover that within 1 or 2 growing seasons, and the soil is completely leached out of any nutrients. And the reason that you have all of this luxurious growth actually is that all of this growth is living off of the nutrients that are freshly falling. See, all of those leaves that are falling, all of that lush undergrowth that's down there, it's creating a humus condition which is being decomposing onto the floor of the jungle, and the huge root systems of the plants. And you look at jungle plants tend to have large root systems that reach out 50, 60 feet from the base of the trees. These huge banyan trees that grow out there, and they're picking up every bit of nutrition that they can from the leafy growth that falls down. And as quickly as it rots into the soil and creates a new level of nutrients, the roots suck it back up, because there's nothing deep down in it. It's all been leached out by the heavy rains. So in this kind of a growing environment, what you need is a system of agriculture that will quickly return nutrients back to the soil in order to maintain any kind of a growing season. So slash and burn agriculture has actually developed a means of doing that. And what you do in slash and burn agriculture is a group of people will come in and find a small section of land, maybe anywhere from 1 acre to 5 acres. If it's a large group, you could go up as high as 10 acres, but usually you wouldn't go much more than 5 or 6 acres of land that would be cleared off. You would clear that land off by going in with bush knives or axes or with sticks, and you break down all the lower bushes, cut down all the larger trees, fell them onto the ground, and then set all of that on fire. Now, before they set it on fire, often what they will do will be to take the larger trees and take out any good timber that they can use. If they need timber for building their houses or for making canoes or for making anything that's constructible, they will harvest that kind of lumber. If they need to build a fence around the garden, they'll use certain kinds of termite-resistant boards to make the fences. And all of the rest, the junk lumber, they will set on fire and burn it up. Once they've burned that up, what they will have done with the burning will be to destroy all of the pests that lived in those trees, in those bushes, which is a great way, see, to keep your garden from becoming infested. You've burned off all of the potential harmful spiders, grubs, other things, ants that would come and attack your crop. And you've also created a lovely bed of ash and potash that will become part of the nutritional base of your garden. Once the men have done this, generally the women will come in, and quite typically there'll be a dedication ceremony, usually some kind of a religious ceremony, in which the field is prayed over and blessed. Then the women are brought in to the garden, and it becomes their job then to take their various plots that are assigned to them by the men and begin planting the sweet potato tubers or the corn or whatever it is that it is necessary for them to plant, so that they can then begin to get their first crop of vegetables from this garden. Now, the whole process is going to go through about 5 distinct stages. The first stage, of course, is going to be picking the virgin territory, virgin forest lands for the garden. Once you have picked that territory, you cut down the bush, cut down the trees, set it on fire, and plant your garden. As soon as you do that, obviously what you have done is you have exposed this soil now to the incessant rains that are typical of the tropics. And as those incessant rains continue to leach all the nutrients lower and lower in the soil, you might have one good growing season, you might have a second growing season. You probably will not get 3 growing seasons off of that land. The nutrients will just simply be washed too low. And so it's time, after you've planted 1 or 2 crops into that garden, to simply abandon that field. And so you move into the third stage, which is called the fallow stage. This may be actually a time when you let the pigs go into the garden. And the pigs will root around, see, find the little tiny tubers that were left in there, root up any bugs or things that they can find in the soil. And they'll root around and twist and turn and find whatever possible food might still exist in the garden. And when the pigs get done with it, there's going to be nothing left in that garden. You abandon it. While this is being abandoned, you've been building next to it, or maybe around in another hillside somewhere else, another garden. This will be next year's crop. In the meantime, this old field that you've abandoned, seeds begin to blow into it. New kinds of bushes start to grow up, wild bushes. Some of those bushes grow into trees. And because nothing is happening there, these trees will grow up, and you'll find that the jungle begins to move back into this field that was once a garden. And as you're flying over an area in which slash and burn agriculture is taking place, you can actually find large sections of land, and you can look and say, okay, now here's a section of territory that's currently being gardened. You can see that it's still under production, and you can see, oh no, there's nothing in that. That's a field that's in fallow. Here's a section of garden up here that's been long abandoned, and it's already into a third stage regrowth. The trees there are maybe 6 or 8 or 10 feet tall. You can look at a second stage growth where the trees are maybe back up to about 20 feet. You can see the jungle being restored to its original pristine nature. And if the population moves on, the jungle will begin to take over again, and it will return to its former state. On the other hand, the people can come back, and they can tell when they come back, and as they look at the various kinds of plants that are growing there. Yes, as long as these plants are growing here, we know that we can plant our kind of food, that this kind of soil will sustain our food because it sustains these kinds of plants. And they become very, very conscious of the types of plants that will grow in an area that's compatible with the nutrition requirements of food. So they mark these areas and sometimes will come back to an old growth area. Well, this is quite typical of slash and burn agriculture. Now, slash and burn agriculture is coming under severe criticism these days because of the massive forest fires that are taking place in Indonesia right now. And so a lot of folk are raising some questions about whether this is a good way to do farming. Actually, it's a marvelous way to do farming. It is one of the most efficient, labor-saving devices that has been developed by tropical farmers. The problem that we're running into is that it is so efficient that modern farmers are using the same technology. And what was being practiced by a small group of horticulturalists are now being practiced by modern day farmers, and the extent to which firing the forest has been taking place has exceeded at a tremendously accelerated pace, and especially with the introduction of chainsaws and steel axes, and so vast amounts of forests are being slashed and burned with the hope of turning them into productive lands, and it's getting far and ahead of the ability of local farmers to control. And this has been a particularly dry season this year, with a consequence that some of the forest fires have begun to rage out of control and have created some significant problems, which is going to end up resulting in attempts by governments now to control slash and burn agriculture, which is going to be a real problem for true horticulturalists, because they have no other way of being able to carry out their agriculture. And I'm not sure what all that's going to mean. But it has been a very labor-efficient way of doing farming for virtually thousands of years. Well, that's just the beginning level of agriculture. We need to move on to talk about the characteristic of intensive agriculture. And intensive agriculture moves us into a whole different set of categories. We want to talk about intensive agriculture in the same manner in which we talked about horticulture. So let's begin with its characteristics. In its characteristics, whereas horticulturalists depended upon human labor, human power, what the wife could do, what the husband could do, what the teenage son could do, intensive agriculture begins to rely on the power of draft animals. They begin to rely on more sophisticated tools, a plow, where you have a large piece of equipment that can begin to break up the soil, that has to be pulled by a larger animal. We are also beginning to rely on irrigation as a means of bringing water into the fields. And you can see that areas like the San Joaquin Valley, anybody here from Bakersfield, Modesto, Fresno, you know, I mean, this great agricultural region of California. I mean, 1/3 of the table vegetables of the whole United States, see, are grown here in Southern California, or at least in California. And it's been made possible, see, through irrigation. See, the Imperial Valley, San Joaquin Valley, you know, massive tracts of land that were totally unproductive as far as table vegetables were concerned until they learned how to do irrigation. So irrigation has changed the whole face of California agriculture. Well, irrigation came in, changed the manner in which we could grow food, and horticulture became intensive agriculture. The third characteristic is that fertilizer is also being brought into use. We're now going to use fertilizer to intensify the ability of the land so that you don't have to be moving from plot to plot. You don't have to have so many fallow plots of land waiting to reproduce itself. You can reproduce it artificially with the use of fertilizers. Now, again, there are different kinds of intensive agriculture. So we need to talk about basically two types of intensive agriculture. The first of these is wet rice farming. This is the most intensive form of intensive agriculture. Wet rice farming, of course, requires the formation of some kind of paddies. And if you've seen any kind of films of life in Southeast Asia or in Asia, you have these vivid pictures of women standing in fields that are flooded. There's banks that hold the water in. The water is 6 to 12 inches deep. They're up to their beyond their ankles in water, and they're bending over planting their rice shoots. Well, in order to do this, what you have is extensive labor groups that have to come in and build these banks so that the water can sit on these level pieces of land. You have to level the land out so that water can sit on it in a nice consistent manner. And if this is on a hillside, this means that you've got to cut into the banks. You've got to level out the lands. You've got to build the banks. You've got to channel the water through nice water channels so that they flow into these paddies and back out of them in a way that doesn't erode the banks away. So there's a tremendous amount of investment in preparing the fields. This is probably the most labor-intensive type of agriculture involved. But once you have established the paddies, okay, there is a tremendous reward for those who have gone to all of this work, because the end result is that you can now have 2 to 3 harvests per year. Once that field has been prepared, it is capable of long-term production. And as the water flows in, it keeps bringing in fresh nutrients into the soil. And if you add to it manure, say, from animals or even human manure, you can add your own fertilizers. You can continue to make the land very, very productive and can continue to have up to 2 to 3 harvests per year. And it pays off in the long term in that you don't have to continually be preparing new fields or new lands for gardening. It does have severe ecological consequences, of course, because it requires land management, water management, and the changing of the natural ecology of a region. Now, that's only one form of intensive agriculture. There is another form of intensive agriculture, which we know primarily here in the West, which would be grain farming, wheat, alfalfa, large cornfields, anything that would be involved in cash cropping, tobacco, cotton. And one of the characteristics of this kind of agriculture is that people will plant huge sections of land in one primary crop. A tobacco farmer may have 100 acres of tobacco. Now, this is significantly different than the old horticulturalist, see, because he would be planting his own food supply. A tobacco farmer has to go down to the grocery store and buy groceries just like you and I do. Got 100 acres. Right? And has to buy groceries from some greengrocer down the street because he's got it all in tobacco. Well, it's called monocrop gardening, and of course it is geared for a market. So one of the characteristics of this kind of agricultural system is that it is market-driven, and you have to keep an eye on what the market will sustain. Is this a good year for growing soybeans, or is this a good year for sorghum? Bad year for corn, great year for lettuce. See, and they follow the market. See, and they try to know exactly what to plant that will bring the best market return on their food. Now, there are a number of stories that have been written about these kinds of events and how they have been exploited, and how getting crops to markets have sometimes forced farmers into bankruptcies and there are a number of sad tales that have come into the literature regarding all of this. But this has been a part of the whole matter of being a farmer. Now, intensive agriculture results in an entirely different social structure for the people. Remember we talked about horticulturalists living in small villages, people working in communal societies and having social affairs as they did their gardening. That doesn't happen as extensively in intensive agriculture. So let's talk about the social impact of intensive agriculture. Several characteristics are going to take place. First of all, there's going to be more food grown on smaller plots of land. Because we are growing more intensively, we're going to bring the land to greater productive capacity. And as a result of bringing that to greater productive capacity, we're going to get more food per square mile off of our gardens. Okay? It's not going to be the casual planting of a backyard plot. This is going to be very planned, systematic use of the soils. So we're going to get a lot more food on a lot smaller plots of land. This is going to have another very significant impact on the manner in which population can begin to accumulate into any one area. Let me give you some examples of the kinds of things that happen when we have different systems of production. Let's talk about hunting and gathering again. When it comes to hunting and gathering, if you are going to live by a purely hunting and gathering lifestyle, it will take 1 square mile of territory to support one person. So one person given 1 square mile of territory can find enough natural food and animals to sustain themselves. Now, that will vary, of course, depending upon how ecologically rich the area is. But let's take a moderately productive area. 1 person per square mile. That means that a husband and wife are going to need 2 square miles of land in order to find enough food to live on. And if they've got 2 kids, they need 4 square miles of land that they can then comfortably wander around finding food and game for their survival. All right, that's typical of a hunting and gathering lifestyle. What happens if we move to a horticultural lifestyle? We move to a horticultural lifestyle, we can talk about the lifestyle, for instance, of the Biola Valley, which was a valley in New Guinea, just a few miles to the east of where we worked. It was one of the most intensely populated horticultural systems in the whole world. Approximately 200 to 440 people per square mile in the Biola Valley. Now that's significantly different. You see, this is what horticulture can do. People can begin to live in larger socioeconomic groups. They can start to improve their ability to exploit the resources of the soil, and they don't need to live quite such dispersed lifestyles or in communities that are so distributed. They can live closer to one another and probably enjoy some of the amenities that come with a larger society. That's what a horticultural lifestyle will sustain. What happens when you move to wet rice farming? Well, if you move to wet rice farming, let's give Java as an example. You move to Java and you can have up to 1,200 people per square mile being supported off of wet rice farming. 1 person per square mile in hunting and gathering, 1,200 people per square mile in intensive agriculture. You see the ability of the earth to support its population when you change your agricultural methodology. Well, this has tremendous implications now, because all of a sudden now we start having people living in larger social groups, and as you get more and more people living together, you start having to have a whole different kind of lifestyle. People can't be as independent, carefree, self-determined. They've got to start living in connection with the rest of the people in the society. Now, there are some good things that do take place. When one farmer can grow enough food for 5 people, instead of everybody having to grow enough for just themselves, if one person can grow food for 5 people, that means that 4 people can now begin to specialize. They are freed from the daily drudgery of farming. Well, what kinds of things would they go into? Well, you can begin to specialize in areas like scholars. Certain people can take time out to think, to reflect, to write, to do research, to become teachers. So you develop a scholarly community. You can develop a group of specialists in the area of religion, people who specialize in the spiritual well-being of their people. You can have specialists as healers, people who are given to medicine. You can have specialists who are people who are given to artistic creation, see, who can become architects or artists or builders. You can begin to build monuments, temples, city walls, temples, palaces, gardens, whatever you want. You can begin carving things, making totem poles, and on and on and on it goes. You can also have people who are specialists in terms of becoming politicians or leaders, or people who become specialists as military in order to protect the well-being of the people. So that you have a full-time army who will then protect the people and are being fed by the farmers who can feel protected from the stray bandits who might come into an area, and they are free then to continue their farming. So specialization is allowed as you begin to move into intensive agriculture. It does have the requirement, though, that there is more of a need for social control. The more people come together, the more potential for conflict. The more conflict you have, the more you need some kind of justice system, arbitration system, control system, so that people's differences of opinion can be somehow or another mediated. Of course, as more and more people begin to live in a region, you have a greater ecological impact on the environment, because you begin to use up natural resources more quickly. You begin to use up more firewood to cook food. You begin to create more waste, garbage, if you would. You begin to use up the natural resources much more quickly, and the ecology begins to change very, very dramatically as you get concentrations of people moving into an area. The 6th requirement that takes place is that you have far more energy consumption taking place. Intensive agriculture does require the use of more energy. And this will become particularly evident when we move into mechanized agriculture. Because when we move into mechanized agriculture, we have to have machinery. Machinery is now going to require us to have electricity, the use of fossil fuels to have gasoline. We will have to have air conditioning if we start growing out in the desert. We'll have to have motorized equipment. We'll have to have water power, and on and on and on it goes as we continue to increase the need for production. Well, let's move into a discussion of mechanized agriculture. This is the most recent development in the agricultural field. And one of the characteristics of mechanized agriculture is that we have begun to move away from the family farm into what is being called agribusiness. A family farm is rapidly moving into the memories of yesteryear. Currently, farms are run as big businesses. For many years, we gave farm subsidies to farmers to help them do well on their farms. It was a way to support the family farm. And so farm subsidies were given by the United States government as a form of tax incentive, as a form of helping farmers out. And so oftentimes they were given money, see, for instance, for not planting a crop. See, don't plant that'll help to sustain price controls, and so they would pay people not to plant, or they would give them some kind of a they would buy their crop from them at a certain price, and they would then go in and plow that crop into the soil as rather than put it onto the market. And so there was these price subsidies that the United States was paying. They did a study of the people who were receiving farm subsidies in the state of California. Do you know where the majority of the price subsidies were being given to, where the farmers lived? I mean, we're talking about farms up there in the San Joaquin Valley, up in Fresno, Modesto, Bakersfield, up in that area, or out there in the Imperial Valley. All of these farms getting farm subsidies, where were the owners living? They're living here in Orange County. Millions of dollars in farm subsidies being given to guys who were living in Laguna Beach. Okay? They were major businessmen. Okay? They were agribusinessmen. Okay? Now I've got, so when we were missionaries, we had a supporter in one of our churches who was a major businessman. He would flash his card, see? And it had his name on it, and underneath his name it had entrepreneur. I love that, you know. Only a businessman would have the chutzpah to call himself an entrepreneur. He was into everything, and he decided that there was going to be big money in agribusiness. So he bought a plot of land out in the desert, right in the middle of nowhere. But he was convinced that there was water under that property. So he got 400 acres. Now, that's a big spread of land, but if it's all desert, it's a worthless piece of property. He went out there, invested big bucks. He dug and dug and dug and dug. They came up with a dry well. He said, keep digging. They kept digging, and boom, they hit an underground lake. Now he's got 400 acres, see, of irrigated land, see. And he's got 400 acres of alfalfa right there in the middle. I mean, everywhere around, nothing but desert, you know, broken down old trailers sitting in empty lots, fences that are all wobbly, blowing in the wind, you know, and scrabbly little dogs running around barking as you drive past them. And you think, gee, I must be on the last outpost to nowhere. All of a sudden you come up over a ridge and boom, 400 acres, green alfalfa, see, in the middle of nothing. Well, he made it, see. His investment paid off. And the reason I happen to know about it is because he was hurting. He needed to harvest his alfalfa, and his son was not feeling well. He'd been sick, and he didn't have time. His other business ventures were running him in arrears, and he couldn't get out there. And I said, oh, sure, I can drive your farm equipment. I mean, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scholar to drive a combine, does it? So I went out there, and he taught me how to drive, you know, their mower. And so for 5 days, see, I drove a mower in a big circle, you know. We're going to do 100 acres out there in the northwest corner. Okay, you know, all day long I'm driving around, you know, mowing alfalfa, see. And every now and again we hit a rock with the blades, and I have to get out and take one of the blades off, put a new blade on, get back in, fire the thing back up, close the doors, turn the air conditioner back on, turn the stereo up, and I'm driving around in a lap of luxury here in the middle of the desert. Everybody else out there sweating. I'm in this nice air-conditioned cab, and cutting alfalfa. See, well, this is agribusiness, and all of the large spreads, see, are being owned by large consortiums of people. The family farm is pretty well gone. It is also an agricultural lifestyle that really relies on the success of the laboratory, the hybrids, the research that is being done is very, very important. If they can't come up with new breeds with more successful stock, they will not be able to produce what they need to do to be able to keep ahead of the latest developments. So hybrid vegetables, new kinds of tomatoes that are resistant to certain kinds of diseases. So it becomes then an agricultural lifestyle that is very technologically dependent. It's dependent upon constant progress. And whereas the early intensive agriculture relied on animal power. This now requires sophisticated machinery. And you can look at any farmer, and he's got a whole barn load of equipment that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They've got a, I mean, here I was driving the mower, you know. Behind me came the baler, see? And he was scooping up what I was cutting in order to bale it up. And then the guy behind him was scooping it up, put it onto the truck that would then take it over and stack it, because there would be a huge big semi that would come pick it up and haul it off to market. I mean, we're talking about tremendous sophisticated machinery, and the keeping it all going. And of course, that means that it is very energy demanding. And we're going to talk about this probably the very last lecture. We're going to talk about how, while we have one of the most efficient agricultural systems in the whole world, we also have the most energy demanding system in the whole world. We are requiring more energy per pound of food than at any time in the history of the human race. Now, this is just one of the consequences of intense agriculture. It's something we're going to have to live with, you see, because we cannot go back to a hunting and gathering lifestyle. See, population pressures have grown so tremendously that we must continue to use mechanized and intensive agricultural strategies in order to feed the world's population. They tell me that the world's population will not level out until we hit about 11 billion people. How do you feed 11 billion people on the face of this planet? Now, you know what? We have the technology. We don't have the distribution systems. We don't have the political systems yet. But we do have the technology. But what it will require is that we somehow learn to use efficiently the energy systems that will not deplete the existing energy systems that we know of. So we've got to come up with more energy efficient production systems. Well, the fourth thing that we want to make note of is that this is all very market driven. Are you aware that in the market system, that 1 cent drop in the price of coffee, see, can drive the whole South American economy into a downward spiral, into a depression? Just 1 cent. So everything is very important when it comes to the price of the market economy. Well, I want to ask 3 questions now about food production, all right? As we kind of bring this all to a conclusion. Which form of production is the most compatible with being a Christian? All right. Which one of these forms that we've talked about, foraging, pastoral, horticulture, intensive, or mechanized agriculture, which one of these is more Christian than another one? You see, God gave us a commandment, and that commandment is that we were to go out as a human race, and we were to be fruitful, and we were to multiply, and we were to make the earth a productive place. Which system best fulfills God's commandment? Is what we have developed in the 20th century more faithful to God's commands than the hunting and gathering lifestyle of Native Americans back 400, 500 years ago? Now, some folk might question the need to even ask that question. In point of fact, while there are 3 questions that I've been asking, there is really only one answer. The Bible does not require any one form of production over another. None is more or less Christian than another. Christians in every era have been asked to be responsible stewards of what God has given us. And in being responsible, we have developed a series of strategies that have allowed us to use the earth in a wholesome and healthy manner. Now, there are some times when we have discovered that we have not used it in a healthy manner. We have discovered, for instance, that it is not good to be planting crops the way we've been planting them in the Midwest. We discovered that for every bushel of corn that we grow in Kansas, we send a bushel of topsoil down the Mississippi River. Now we need to learn how to be more efficient stewards of God's creation. But in point of fact, if we are efficient users of God's creation, there is no one form that is more important than another. But I make this point because, you see, this has not always been the same answer. When the early Americans first showed up here in this country, there was a conflict over the lifestyle of the early colonists and the early Indians. And an early Revolutionary War hero by the name of Benjamin Lincoln was appointed as head of the Commissioner to Indian Affairs. And here's what he said about the Native American lifestyle. He said, "I believe that it was God's plan to fully people this earth. I am confident that sooner or later this will of God will be accomplished, and that as a result, no men will be allowed to live by hunting on the land that God has given to them if that land is capable of better improvement. So, if the savages cannot be civilized and quit their present lifestyle, they will, in consequence of their stubbornness, dwindle and molder away from perhaps causes imperceptible to us, until the whole race shall have become extinct." You know what he's advocating? Genocide. Genocide of the Native Americans. Why? Because they're not farmers in the same way that the colonists were farmers. You see, here was a competition between lifestyles that made one more Christian than another. It's not a matter of more Christian. It's a matter of the fact that no matter what the strategies we use, we must be responsible stewards. And if we take this point of view, then, well, we're going to quit right there. We're not going to go on to the pristine states. We'll end by simply stating that for us, stewardship of the earth's resources is the most important commandment that's been given to us. And somehow or another, we need to come up with a means whereby the needs of people can be fulfilled, and so that the world's populations can be adequately fed. And this will involve more than just agricultural systems, but whole socioeconomic systems whereby we are able to distribute the food in an equitable basis to all peoples. And with that, we'll let you go for the evening. Thank you again for your attention.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.